Hey everyone, Zaronce here. Today I want to talk to you about Arms Warrior in Battlegrounds in 9.0.5 and looking just a little bit ahead to 9.1, but not too far, not too much. Just going to take things a little bit slow here. Alright, so without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to try to keep this as quick as possible so you don't have to sit through a whole 30-minute video about this or that. But with that being said, let me just bring this up here. Alright, so we're going to start with our Covenant options. So one of the themes that you're going to see across the board here for Arms Warrior is that you have a lot of options, you have a lot of ways to build your character. There's not really a single best way, there's a lot of preference options that come into it. Alright, so as far as Covenants are concerned, Venthyr, Kyrian, and Necrolord are all pretty much equal, and it just depends on how you want to build your character. So you can see right away, this is just the first of very many different setups that you can have for your Arms Warrior, right? So your Covenant choice pretty much comes down to how you want to contribute to your group. Venthyr is it's a pure damage concept. It's high uptime, consistent pressure, not as bursty as the other options, but just steady, consistent damage with good uptime, especially when you combine Condemn with Death Sentence. That's really what it boils down to. And Condemn being shadow damage really helps with the consistent damage. As you can see, I went Venthyr, but it's just a preference thing. It's really just a preference thing. Kyrian, on the other hand, is more of a utility option. It goes great with maybe a caster heavier comp, so that you can help peel through your casters with the Kyrian Spear. It goes great with a Frost DK, so they grip everyone on top, do their stun, their Dragon Stun Chill Streak go, and you throw your Kyrian Spear Blade Storm on top of that. So Kyrian's really great for its utility options, and Necrolord is really great in the middle of like a big melee cleave, like with a Ret Pally and a DK, for example. Any melee cleave where you have two other melee with you who really benefit from mastery gain, because that's really what you provide is a ton of mastery. And so, as I said, Kyrian is more your utility option. Necrolord is more setting up your allies option, and it really ultimately just comes down to preference. That's really all it's about. Alright, so as far as Soulbinds are concerned, for Venthyr, if you go Venthyr, you're going to want to go with Najia, or Nahia, if she's Hispanic, I'm not sure. She doesn't particularly look it, but, everyone's soul in... Anyway, we're getting off base here. Alright, so she's really good. Thrill Seeker is really good. It's a really good consistent damage increase. And Familiar Predicaments is really good for maintaining uptime, which, as we mentioned, that's what Ventyr's all about. Uptime, consistent damage, consistent pressure. So Familiar Predicaments, the Snare Root Effect reduction, especially the Root Effect reduction. God Mages are so goddamn annoying, man. Roots in general are so annoying. So this is really a great talent to have. It's really nice to have. And Thrill Seeker is great. It's a burst proc, but it's consistent. It's steady. It builds up fairly quickly. And so you'll get consistent use out of this in a Battleground setting. As far as Kyrian goes, you're going to want to go with Pelagos. He's pretty much always the option for Kyrian, just because of the mastery buff that you get when you drop Spear or when you use your Kyrian ability. He's got other decent options. His final row, which decreases damage you take when you use an ability that's different than one before, is pretty good for Warrior because we alternate a lot between different abilities. So that's pretty easy to maintain uptime. And then as far as Necrolord goes, this is the only one where you really have any option. Theoretically, you have an option, but I don't actually think that you really are going to have an option. At least I don't suggest that you look at it that way. So what I suggest is that you go with a many. And the reason that I say a many is because of this lead by example right here. Right? So as a Necrolord, your entire basis for that Covenant is enhancing your teammates, right? It's great for enhancing your teammates. And so when you drop your Conqueror's Banner, you give them that huge mastery buff. Boom, now you add on top of that, you give them a little bit of extra strength too. And it just makes their bursts and your combined burst that much more deadly. I think that you could go with Merilith for more of a utility option. Ultimate Form is really good for utility option. A little bit of self-healing just makes that defensive a little stronger. And Ooze's Frictionless Coating is really good. That's just a passive defensive. But at the same time, I mean, think about Sulfuric Emission as an Arms Warrior. You intervene your ally's taking a lot of damage, you intervene them, and suddenly you're like, oh shit, like I'm taking a lot more damage than I thought I'd take, and boom, Sulfuric Emission procs, and now your healer has a little breathing room to get you back up. From a damage perspective, You also have the option of going with another potency conduit and then having an increased movement speed, which is really great for just maintaining uptime and everything like that. So for Necrolord, I strongly suggest Many. I think it goes great with what you're trying to create as a Necrolord warrior. It really ties in with your whole shebang, and so I think that's really the best way to go there. Now, as far as conduits are concerned, for potency conduits, Crash the Ramparts is your best conduit. This is the one you always want to have. So if you have a row in any situation where you sometimes alternate between two options, you know, like say every once in a while I want to take fancy footwork, if that were actually something that I did, then I would put Crash the Ramparts into this slot that I would never swap out, because you always want to run Crash the Ramparts. It's better than Mortal Combo, which is the next one I'm going to suggest. You always want to run Crash the Ramparts. Alright, number 2 is Mortal Combo. Mortal Combo's pretty consistent, pretty solid, decent extra little burst damage there, so you can't be too upset about it. And the only other conduit that I would ever run would be, if I were Necrolord, I would consider running Veteran's Repute, which is a strength buff when you drop your Conqueror's Banner, right? So if you get that to like 200 eye level, it's like a 14% strength buff, and then you add on a Many's Lead by Example, which is a minimum 5%. If you hit 2 allies, it becomes a 9%. So pretty much every time you drop your Conqueror's Banner, you get like a 23-ish% damage increase, or strength increase. And then, you know, you throw on Warbreaker, you throw on Avatar, and that's what makes certain classes really strong in the meta right now, is the amount of modifiers that they can throw on top of each other, like Conqueror's Banner, Avatar, and Warbreaker. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. I would probably swap out Mortal Combo for that, and just really focus on basing your goes around that 2-minute cooldown, around that Conqueror's Banner. As far as finesse conduits are concerned, you have two options. You can go with Inspiring Presence and or Safeguard. If you have room to fit both, that's another reason why the Sulfuric Emissions is so good. It's because you can fit both of these into your mix. But this is pretty much just a preference option. Do you want the consistent damage decrease from Intervene? Do you want the you know, burstier Inspiring Presence buff? This is especially good if you find yourself consistently running, Master and Commander. It really makes it especially good. It's just such a major cooldown, and it provides so much breathing room. It really can nullify a lot of the scariest burst cooldowns in the game if you have it available. But I prefer Safeguard. I prefer the consistent damage decrease. I think it really helps save allies. You know, if you know your Druid pops into bear form and then you intervene them, it's like they're pretty much being tickled. And it makes it less likely that you intervene someone and then realize that you're about to die because you intervene them, and now you're taking a shit ton of damage. So it's just a safer bet, I think. But both of these are really good. The other ones aren't really aren't really worth considering. Excuse me. As far as endurance conduits go, Stalwart Guardian, hands down, the #1 pick. Especially as we get higher and higher levels. I mean, Die by the Sword on a 1.5 cooldown is just absurd. It's absolutely absurd. So I would never consider running anything other than this singular endurance conduit. If you absolutely have to pick something else, then Fueled by Violence, but not really worth considering. And if you're going with a Fueled by Violence, if you have that socketed, then it suddenly your Mastery and your Haster become a lot more important in your stat priority. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. Alright, so next up are Legendary powers. These are going to come down to, in large part, what conduit, or what covenant you're running. Alright, so as a Venthyr, I run Exploiter. I will always run Exploiter. I never swap it out. This is for BGs, keep in mind. This is for BGs. This is not, you know, like if you're in Arena against RMP, then maybe you swap out for Misshapen Mirror. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about consistent options for Battlegrounds, random Battlegrounds, rated Battlegrounds. You know, consistent options here. So Exploiter for Venthyr, #1. For Kyrian, Unhinged to pair with your Bladestorm Kyrian Spear combo. This one is not as set in stone as Exploiter is for Venthyr. You have one other option here, and this option is also what I would run if I were Necrolord, which is Battlelord. Right, overpowers a 40% chance to reset the CD on Mortal Strike and reduce its rage cost. Really good for just consistent, steady damage, which is ultimately what Arms Warrior is all about. That's what makes it so deadly, just that consistent, steady damage. So, Exploiter for Venthyr, Unhinged for Kyrian, or Battlelord for Kyrian, and Battlelord for Necrolord. Those are the options. Keep in mind, when you're making your Legendary, you always want to try to target the slot that has the highest primary stat allocation, right? So neck or wrist for Battlelord, you want to go wrist. Shoulder or finger for Explorer, you want to go shoulder. And wrist or hands for Unhinged, you want to go hands. All right, that's because your legendary item is going to be higher eye level than anything else you can get at the moment, right? And especially as it relates to warrior, your secondary stats are all so close in value, other than verse, which is easily your best. Your other secondary stats are also close in value that it doesn't really matter. Like, it's not worth considering, oh well, you know, I'm putting this on my shoulder, but I can get a shoulder that has the secondary stats that I want, so maybe I'll put it on my finger instead because I can only get one ring that has the like, no, that's not worth it. You know, get more of a balance of your stats, but we'll get into that actually right now. All right, so while we're talking about this, stat priority for arms is really difficult, and depending on where you look, you're going to find a lot of different things that people say, because at the end of the day, our stats are all really good, and what we want is a balance more than anything. This isn't the kind of spec where you want every single piece to have mastery, or every single piece to have crit, or every single piece to have haste, or whatever. The only thing you want on every single piece is versatility. Versatility is far and away our best stat. Offensively, defensively, just get the PvP gear. It's got tons of verse on it, and just keep it that way. All right, enchant with verse, gem with verse, everything like that. At a certain point, you're going to hit the 30% threshold where you start to get less value from verse. Don't worry about it. It's still your best stat by a lot. All right, just get verse, please. All right. So after that, it depends a little bit on your covenant as well. For Venthyr, I suggest verse, crit, and then mastery or haste. There's two different ways that you can build that. I like to try to get a balance between mastery and haste. Most other guides are going to tell you to go haste and then just ignore mastery. I think a balance is a lot better. Not just because of the deep wounds damage that it provides, but because of the increased damage that you deal to people. But I think especially like those guys that say crit and then haste and then mastery way at the bottom, those are arena focused guys, which means it's a lot more about single target pressure. Whereas in a battleground setting, it's a lot more about cleave, AoE, you know, things like Blade Storm, applying wounds to everyone, and then sweeping strikes, cleaving people who have deep wounds up so that you're dealing increased damage to them. All that stuff adds up, and so I think mastery gains a little more value in a BG setting. And so for that reason, I put verse, and then crit, and then mastery a little bit above haste. Maybe equal, but they're all so close. They're really all so close. So it's not even worth like just go for the highest eye level, and then once you get up to higher, like Great Vault, just go for the highest eye level. Take the best piece available to you at that time. Don't really worry about the secondary stat breakdown. And the same goes for no matter what covenant you are. So Venthyr, the only difference is that crit is a little higher up. For the other covenants, haste is probably going to be tied with mastery maybe for your best stat, a little bit above crit, but really at the end of the day, just get a balance of every stat. Get as rounded of every stat as you can. You want a little bit of haste to make the spec feel smoother, to not be global cooldown locked as much. You want some crit for a little bit of burst damage and for the extra rage gen. And you want mastery for a little extra passive damage, a little extra single target burst potential for all those modifiers. Remember we talked about how important modifiers are in the meta right now in 9.0.5. And so having that additional modifier through your mastery of increased damage dealt to a single target really helps out, right? Increased damage the enemy takes from you by 14% with 5% mastery. So that's pretty good on top of the other modifiers that we have, on top of Warbreaker, on top of Avatar, and then potentially on top of the Conqueror's Banner as well. So next up we have talents. All right, your talents are pretty much set in stone, and they're not really going to change much, right? Sudden Death, you pretty much always run. Stormbolt, you pretty much always run. You could run double time for extra uptime, but the ability to have your own stun is just much better. Massacre, you pretty much always run. You'll see in 2s and 3s, some non-Venthyr warriors are going to run Rend because it helps them deal with matchups against plate classes, and they don't have Condemn for that shadow damage, so they go with Rend for breaking through those high armor classes. But in a BG setting, that's not really as big of a deal. There's a wider array of people around you, and you don't really have the spare rage to be maintaining Rend on an enemy. So it has potential, but I would still recommend Massacre, at least for the time being. D-stance you pretty much need. If you get caught in a stun at a D-stance and you don't have your trinket, you're dead. So having something like Second Wind or Battering Stride isn't going to save you in that situation, but if you can, be cognizant of when you have your trinket available and stay in D-stance in any situation where you might even think that you might be swapped to, then it's going to save your life a ton. Anytime you intervene, you want to be in D-stance or you might die. So D-stance, you really have to take it. Warbreaker, again, this is such a good talent, and it's even better in a Battleground setting because of its AoE potential. So, you know, a Warbreaker into a Blaze Storm is a ton of AoE damage, it's a ton of AoE pressure, especially with Storm of Destruction if you have mortal wounds, but we'll get into that later. The other ones aren't even really worth mentioning. Next tier is Avatar. Avatar is amazing because it's just another one of those damage modifiers, and on top of that, it breaks you out of your roots and snares. So between Avatar and Blaze Storm, we have 2 ways to get out of snares on our own, which is really great. And then just the extra damage, the extra pressure, the short cooldown. It's available every other Warbreaker, so the cooldown lines up really well for that. And it just adds a ton of damage to our kit, which is great. And for the kill is decent, but it's too easily shut down anytime that, you know, you go for your Warbreaker and you get CC'd. Like, now you have 2 talents that are totally useless instead of like, oh well, that Warbreaker go didn't work, so I can now pop. You know, they've disarmed me or whatever, so they don't have that available, so now I can pop Avatar and put up some heavy damage. You know what I mean? Not to mention 10% haste isn't huge compared to a straight 20% damage for 20 seconds, generating rage and removing roots and snares. Like, that's just too strong. You gotta take it. Next up, Dreadnought. Anger management's decent, but in a Battleground setting with a lot of targets, the extra cleave from Dreadnought is just really powerful. The ability, especially as Venthyr, to build up overpower charges more quickly or overpower stacks more quickly on top of the Exploiter stacks for those juicy mortal strikes is really strong. Anger management is a lot better in an arena setting, I think, to desync your offensive cooldowns from the enemy's defensive cooldowns. Whereas in a Battleground, just the consistent cleave damage, the consistent pressure from Dreadnought really starts to shine. And I mean, even in a 2v2, 3v3 setting, Dreadnought is still generally taken over Anger Management. Anger Management is more of a tech pick. And so when you throw in all these extra enemies on top of that, the value of Dreadnought really starts to increase exponentially. Alright, PvP talents. Sharpen Blade, you never swap this out. Ever. You always run Sharpen. Alright, if you're Venthyr, you always run Death Sentence. Never swap it out, always run Death Sentence. If you're Kyrian, Storm of Destruction makes your Blaze Storm line up perfectly with your Kyrian Spear for a really deadly combo every minute. Really good. On top of that, in any Battleground setting, the fact that Blaze Storm applies mortal wounds to all enemies is amazing for putting out a ton of pressure on an entire team. Anytime you're playing with a Warlock or a Shadow Priest or anyone that has really good cleave, a Death Knight, anyone who has really good cleave or spread pressure, dots, whatever, being able to mortal wound an entire team is just really powerful. So I suggest always running this no matter what covenant you are. It's just that particularly for Kyrian, it's really strong. If you're Necrolord, I would swap out Death Sentence for War Banner. And the reason for that is, as we mentioned before with Conqueror's Banner, Necrolord is all about enabling your teammates to do a fuck ton of damage. Alright, and so War Banner is really great for that. What I would do if I was running this is I would save it, I would hold it for an extra 30 seconds, use it every 2 minutes with my Conqueror's Banner, so that when I drop Conqueror's Banner, it's just so much more pressure. They can't CC us as consistently, they can't snare us as consistently, and they just can't stop our damage pretty much, right? We have this huge Conqueror's Banner buffing everyone's damage, buffing everyone's speed. We have War Banner buffing everyone's speed, preventing crowd control or reducing the duration at least of crowd control, which is great because, you know, if there's a 7-second poly and I pop this, I throw this down before the poly and it's 3.5 now, even if they kill the banner, the next poly is going to be DR'd from the original, which was already on pretty much a second DR poly. So just a really strong option. And then if you want for more of a group build, so you're Kyrian and you don't really feel the need for Death Sentence, you can run Master and Commander, which especially when paired with the Inspiring Presence Conduit is just really strong, right? A 2-minute Rallying Cry, 15% additional health from that, 28% additional health from a 200 eye level Conduit, plus 2.8 additional seconds duration, right? So it's almost a 13-second duration, and it gives just a fuck ton of health. And that just about wraps it up for the Warrior Guide, right? So this is where Warrior's at in 9.0.5 from a BG setting. I think that as we move forward into 9.1, unfortunately, I think Venthyr is going to fall off a little bit, and I'm already considering swapping off Venthyr on my Warrior at the end of this season and getting my next Covenant Renown up and everything like that. I think it's really going to come down to Kyrian and Necrolord next season. as it stands right now, the way that Condemn works is it already deals a little bit less damage than Execute. It's just that it deals shadow damage, and so against a cloth or a leather class, it deals less damage than Execute, but then as you move up to a mail or a plate class, it deals more damage than Execute. And so overall, Condemn isn't really like infinitely better than Execute. It's just different and strong, and it has, you know, the synergy with Death Sentence, which makes it really good. But Execute's getting a 10% buff in this patch for non-Venthyr warriors, which is just going to make that difference even smaller. I think it's really going to push warriors to go Kyrian or Necrolord because they get something new and unique. And as I said already, the difference between Condemn and Execute isn't that big to start with, and it's just going to get smaller. So I think looking forward to 9.1, I personally am probably going to make my warrior Necrolord. I think it depends on what you foresee yourself playing with. I think for most, if you mostly play with casters, I think Kyrian's a better option. I think if you mostly play with melee cleaves, especially ones that benefit from mastery, Necrolord 100%. You know, a Ret, a DK, Windwalker, you know, any melee that really benefits from mastery. And I say melee because it only applies to your closest allies, and so you want to make sure that they're going to be on top of you. And so any melee that really benefits from mastery, if you play with them a lot, go Necro. Kyrian works really well with Frost DK as well, so that's always an option. But me personally, I'm going to be going Necrolord. I think it looks like a lot of fun, and I can see my friends giggling about how much damage they do, and I'm just like sitting there smiling because I know that I did a little bit of that. I helped out with that, you know what I'm saying? So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the guide. I hope it helps you out a little bit. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below. If you want to see me play my warrior, you want to ask questions real time, you can check out my stream, twitch.tv/Zaronce. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure you like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me. I really appreciate the support. And so I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was helpful, and I hope to see you around the channel.